you are the landlord running the tenants and getting rental payments from the tenants that could pay for your mortgage. And it's a beautiful thing, but it isn't that simple, because there are a lot of things that are overlooked before people buy these multi-units, and it gets them in trouble down the road because they didn't do the due diligence necessary to protect their investment. Hello and welcome to the show, the Curington Now show. I'm your host, RJ Curington, owner of Curington Law, and I'm a real estate attorney that is also a business law attorney and an estate planning attorney, helping investors, entrepreneurs, and professionals build wealth and protect their wealth, and build and protect their empires, and doing so mindfully. And that's what the podcast is touching on as well. Those items of business that allow for businesses, business owners, investors, and professionals to live a life where they're accumulating wealth but doing so mindfully. So we're going to touch on those things. We have guests on the show that also talk about their experience and how they've accumulated and built success. And today we're talking about one of the more lucrative real estate investment house hacks that people invest in, and that's a multi-unit. A multi-unit property is a property where you have multiple units, multi-unit, 1 level, 2 levels, 3 levels, 4 levels, fourplex, triplex, duplex. These have tenants, and you are the landlord running the tenants and getting rental payments from the tenants that could pay for your mortgage. And it's a beautiful thing, but it isn't that simple, because there are a lot of things that are overlooked before people buy these multi-units, and it gets them in trouble down the road because they didn't do the due diligence necessary to protect their investment. And so what I've seen is owners that turn to sellers less than a year of owning the property because they just got into it without doing the due diligence, just looking at the end goal of having rental payments and passive income coming in to pay their mortgage, but they forgot about all these other things that go into it, the other costs and expenses, and even the tenant selection. So we're going to talk about that today. And at the end of it, you're going to feel like going into a multi-unit is for you, and you're ready. And you're going to be looking right away, all right? And then you're going to just really make a wise choice, or a wiser choice. So, there are no guarantees, because even if you do a lot of this due diligence, hey, something may happen that, you're like, wow, this is a huge financial obstacle. But alas, we will dive right into it. First, I want to say thank you to everyone that's been listening. Spread the word here. We're growing the pod as much as possible just to get this out to as many people, because I feel like a lot of this stuff isn't really there. And if it is there, it costs a lot. It is hard to understand. It's not as digestible. It's painful in that regard. And so my goal is to just make this as simple as possible for you and make these really quick so that you can get the information and run with it. All right. Again, this is really just general advice. And so I don't want you to take this as like law, okay? This is just general information. If you have questions or anything like that, just feel free to reach out and I'll be happy to help you. But let's get to it, all right? So the first thing you want to look for, okay, when you're buying, okay, a multi-unit, you want to, and just to forward, when the first thing you want to do after you've found your multi-unit and you're going into like the due diligence portion, wherever state you're in, it could be different. You could have an attorney, like once you put an offer, I'm talking more so for Illinois, but For other states, it may be different. You may have to do these things that I'm going to talk about before providing an offer or going under contract. So I'm just going to talk about just your general due diligence. So the first thing you want to look out for is the 12-month payment, the rent payments, the rent roll. All right. And as a seller, you want to have these things like readily accessible. And what this is a 12-month, however long, like even beyond that, history of the payments made by the tenants. Okay. So the 2 or 3 or 4 tenants that are in the property, you want to make sure that they've been paying on time. They haven't had a history of late payments, and you want to see like when they are making payments. Are these tenants that are paying early, are 15 days late, or right at that precipice of being late after the grace period? You want to make sure that that information, because the last thing you want to do is go into the property and you're working with tenants that are either like really late payment makers, and that may not feel great to you that they're paying so late, especially if you come in new. It may have been a relationship with that landlord that they allowed for those payments. But if you're talking about me, like I want those payments on the first. If earlier, I want those things to come in, and I'm not even worried about it. I'm not worried about the tenants making late payments. All right, so that's the rent roll you want to make sure. And then with that, the payment history, you even want to maybe talk to the seller or listing agent to just make sure that they have been making payments, like what kind of tenants that you're working with. That's like really the number one thing that I see is just tenants that are kind of a disaster. And then you have to worry about the eviction and possible eviction, things like that. And that's just a nightmare really in any state that you go. Some states are more landlord friendly than others, but a lot are tenant friendly. All right, another thing you want to make sure of is any contracts, okay? Any contracts with third parties, property management. Some have coin laundry management. Those things, you want to make sure that those contracts are either transferred to you or they're completely removed at the closing. All right, because you don't want to take on something that you really don't want to. You may be not familiar with the management. Their fees may be higher than you really would like. You want to make sure that's something that is either removed or transferred over to you. All right, and then the other thing that you want to make sure of is the roof. Okay, you want to have a roof over your head. Sometimes you're going to be living in the property, so again, you want to make sure the roof is good, but you also want to make sure the tenants have a roof over their head that's not going to need repair in the immediate future or is damaged to the point of it could cave in at any day now. All right, so just ask for the history of the roof. How new is it? Was it replaced recently? Was it fixed? Like, were there any leaks that occurred during a storm or in the last 12 months, or the history of the property? Okay, you want to make sure that you have that knowledge, and that's like really during the inspection period. So when you inspect, really like make sure that your inspector's really diving into the roof, and then that leads to inspections. So we've talked about rent rolls, we've talked about history of payments, we've talked about the roof and some of those things. And just another inspection item is are the utilities. You want to make sure that all of those things work. You want to make sure all of those are intact and not on their last leg, so to speak. All right. Then with those utilities, you want to make sure that the utility bills are paid, okay, and are up to payment the date of closing. All right, final water bills, things like that. You want to make sure that that's intact so that you're not getting that inherited or you're not taking that on. And during this due diligence period, you're going to want to make sure that you have the zoning certificate in that state or in that county, just to make sure that the property's been zoned appropriately. Okay, zoned as a 3-unit, 4-unit. All right, you also want to, when you're doing the inspection, make sure that there's the heating and cooling that works, things like that. All right, diligence period as well. You want to make sure that there hasn't been any litigation or violations with the city. You also want to make sure that you have the security deposits, make sure that those are transferred over. Okay, and then check in with your landlord, tenant ordinances and rules and regs in your state to make sure that you're not running afoul any security deposit rules. Okay, upholding security deposit, etc. Okay, you can typically hold on to that, but just making sure that when the lease is up, that the tenant has like an opportunity to have that back, have that security deposit back after you've inspected and made sure that there weren't any damages or anything like that to the property, and fairly taking out money out of the security deposit for any damages. Okay, which leads to the lease. Okay, you want to have a copy of the lease. All right, we've talked about the rent rolls, we talked about the late payment history, we've talked about the roof, we talked about the utilities, the inspection. Now we're talking about the lease. All right, so take a look at the lease. Make sure you get a copy of each lease for each tenant. It could be different for each. Don't assume that they're all a month-to-month or a year lease. They could be expiring. They could be a couple of months out. You want to make sure that you know the lease term, because sending notice to vacate, and if you want new tenants, you'll need some time to deliver those notices to vacates, which is like 30 to 60 days, depending on how long the tenant's been in the property, which will lead to the next thing. But when you're reviewing the leases, make sure the lease is in a term that you prefer, that you can work with when you're becoming the owner, so that you know how long this tenant's staying, what notice I need to provide, or what notice does the seller need to provide beforehand to make sure that the tenant vacates. You can even kind of like let the tenant know through the seller that you're going to be entering the property. That's something that we ask for as well. Okay, so really make sure you're reviewing the leases, make sure you know what the protocol is if you're taking on that tenant, or do they pay for the utilities and you pay for the common elements. Make sure to know how that situation is from the outset. All right, and the next thing you want to have an assignability of lease agreement, okay, or like some sort of tenant estoppel, things like that. And these things just assure that you're getting transferred the lease and you're the rightful owner and new landlord, okay? And some of the, like another document that this is called, notice to tenant, okay? Notice to tenant that you are the new owner, and you hand that to the tenant with your payment information, contact information, so that they know who's the owner and who and how to make payments. All right, and then that assignment agreement or tenant estoppel or condo estoppel, okay, that's gonna be the thing that you'll want to need to make sure that there haven't been any claims against the landlord that would transfer to you. All right, you want to be held harmless from any claims from the tenants to the seller. All right, because if there's litigation or something like that has occurred and you're the new landlord now, you kind of take on responsibility for that as the new landlord. All right, so just, you want to make sure that transfers over smoothly without any worries about being liable for those claims. And the converse is right for the seller. You want to make sure that you're protected for anything that happens during the new owner's time in the property. All right, so any claims you're held harmless from. Okay, and with that, we want to make sure that the permitting is acceptable and has been obtained for any improvements, things like that. There aren't any open permits, things like that would transfer over to you. All right, permits for any renovations, any improvements to the property. Okay, and then you want to get your survey. Sellers, make sure to have your survey ready for the buyer. All right, and buyer, make sure to get that survey at the closing as well. Okay, and I talked a little bit about the leases, but I want to just circle back on the leases to just make sure that you're knowing like exactly the types of leases that you're getting. If it's a oral lease, you want to be careful with those. You want to make sure you're getting things in writing. If it is oral, it's going to be mostly a month to month or so. But if you're a seller, try to get leases that are written. All right. Some states have like uniform leases that you could use. All right. So with that said, also when you're a buyer, I want to emphasize the inspection. Just make sure that you do get an inspection. If you go as is, that's fine as well, but it's a little bit risky. Okay. I know that from like a standpoint of getting your offer accepted, you want to go as is, or in some states it is as is. Like you have to do all of that, the due diligence beforehand. But just make sure you take a look at the property in that inspection period and really do a deep dive and feel comfortable with a lot of those things, the plumbing, the electrical, things like that, the roof that we mentioned, just so that you're sure of the potential financial payments that you'll need to make and financial obligations you have to make as a landlord owner. Okay, and with that being said, you're set. I mean, lending, we're not going to talk about that. We're not going to talk about a few other things that are more complex with these things. But if you have questions, if you have comments, leave those comments in the chat there. With this is just like general knowledge standpoint thing to make sure that you're ready to be an investor in real estate, owning your multi-unit. The multi-unit is a fantastic tool for you to build wealth and to generate passive income and cash flow. All right, but you want to do so in a way where you're not worried about your reserves or cash flow being hindered by a huge financial undertaking like a new roof that's $10,000 to $15,000, or new electrical, or worse, oh my goodness, a eviction of a tenant that could take years and just give a huge headache. We're not going to do that. All right, we're going to try to not do that. Give me a call. I'm at RJ Curington Esquire. I'm at Curington Law on Instagram. You can look me up on LinkedIn as well and reach out. I'm here on YouTube, podcasts, here on Spotify, and iTunes there on Apple Podcasts. So reach out to me. I'm here for you, and good luck with your investment. All right, be well. Hi, my friend. Just a disclaimer. None of these things were legal advice or establish a lawyer-client relationship. It's just general knowledge to help you. All right. Thank you.